A freezing puppy begs a man for help on the coldest night of the year, looking up with eyes full of desperation. Jack Holloway, a grieving widower, has no plans to keep the dog. But when he discovers a life-changing secret in the puppy's collar, everything changes. As he sets out to find the owner, he uncovers a heartbreaking story that will pull at your heartstrings. What happens when he finally meets Emily, the woman who abandoned her dog? And what shocking truth will she reveal that changes Jack's life forever? Tune in to see how a dog's plea for help leads to redemption, second chances, and an unbreakable bond. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the windows of Jack Holloway's remote cabin. Snowflakes pelted against the glass in angry swirls, creating a white curtain that blocked out the world beyond. Inside, the cabin was quiet, except for the crackling of logs in the stone fireplace. Jack sat in his worn leather armchair, a glass of whiskey dangling from his fingers. The amber liquid caught the firelight, creating golden reflections that danced across his weathered face. His blue eyes, once bright and alert from years of police work, now held a distant, hollow look. The flames cast long shadows on the walls, making the cabin feel larger and emptier than it actually was. Pictures hung in simple wooden frames, collecting dust, happy moments frozen in time that now felt like they belonged to someone else's life. In one, Jack stood proudly in his police uniform, his arm around a beautiful woman with auburn hair and a bright smile. Sarah, his wife. In another, he knelt beside a noble-looking German shepherd wearing a K9 unit vest. Shadow. Jack took another sip of whiskey, letting the burn chase away the cold that seemed to have settled permanently in his bones. 3 years had passed since he'd lost them both. Sarah to an illness that moved too fast for anyone to stop, and Shadow in the line of duty just months later. The memories crashed over him like waves, threatening to pull him under. "Should have been me," he muttered to the empty room, his voice rough from disuse. The words hung in the air, mixing with the wood smoke and the endless howl of the wind. The cabin creaked and groaned under the assault of the storm. Jack had chosen this place for its isolation, far from the city where every street corner held a reminder of what he'd lost. Out here, he could pretend the world had stopped turning. The day Sarah died, the day Shadow took that bullet meant for him. He lifted the glass to his lips again, but paused at an unfamiliar sound. Through the storm's fury came a desperate scratching at his back door. Jack frowned, setting down his whiskey with a dull thunk. Probably a raccoon or some other creature seeking shelter from the blizzard. The scratching came again, more insistent this way. Jack pushed himself up from his chair with a grunt, his joints protesting the movement. "Go on, get out of here," he called out gruffly, taking heavy steps toward the door. But when he yanked it open, ready to scare off whatever wildlife had wandered onto his porch, the words died in his throat. There, collapsed in a heap of wet fur and trembling limbs, was a German shepherd. The dog's dark eyes looked up at Jack, filled with a pain and desperation that struck him like a physical blow. Jack stood frozen in the doorway, snow whipping past him into the cabin. The dog weakly lifted its head and nudged Jack's hand with its cold nose. The gentle touch broke through Jack's paralysis, even as his heart clenched at how similar this dog looked to Shadow. "I can't," he whispered, but even as the words left his mouth, his body was moving. Years of training and instinct took over as he bent down to examine the animal. The dog was male, no collar, but well cared for despite his current state. His fur was matted with snow and ice, and his whole body shook with cold. Jack's hands trembled as he carefully slipped them under the dog's body. "Easy now," he murmured, lifting the shepherd, The dog was heavy, but Jack managed to carry him inside, kicking the door shut behind them. He laid the German Shepherd down near the fireplace, where the flames cast a warm glow over his fur. The dog curled into himself, still shivering violently, his eyes never leaving Jack. Those eyes, they held such profound sadness, such quiet understanding, that Jack had to look away. "Stay," he ordered gruffly, though the dog clearly had no intention of moving. Jack walked to the hallway closet, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floors. He pulled out an old wool blanket, one he hadn't used since Sarah. Her scent was long gone from the fabric, but the memory of her wrapping herself in it on cold nights still lingered. Returning to the fireplace, Jack knelt beside the shepherd. His hands shook as he draped the blanket over the trembling animal. "You're safe now," he muttered, more to himself than the dog. The shepherd responded by pressing his cold nose against Jack's hand again, a gesture of trust that made Jack's throat tight. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, something shifted in the atmosphere. The emptiness that had seemed so absolute just hours before felt somehow less crushing. Jack settled back into his armchair, but this time, instead of losing himself in memories of what he'd lost, his eyes remained fixed on the dog slowly warming by his fire. As the night wore on, exhaustion finally caught up with Jack. His eyes grew heavy, and the emotional weight of the evening pressed down on him like a physical thing. The last thing he saw before sleep claimed him was the German Shepherd, still wrapped in Sarah's blanket, watching over him with those knowing eyes. Morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows, casting a pale glow across Jack's living room. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in pristine white. Jack stirred on his couch, where he'd fallen asleep watching over the German Shepherd. His neck ached from the awkward position, a reminder of another night spent away from his bed. The dog lay curled up near the dying embers of the fireplace, no longer shivering. In the morning light, Jack could see him better, a handsome animal with a thick coat and intelligent eyes. Those eyes tracked Jack's movements as he pushed himself up from the couch, joints creaking in protest. "Might as well get some breakfast," Jack muttered, more to himself than the dog. In the kitchen, he went through his morning routine mechanically. Coffee first, then eggs and toast. The familiar motions felt different somehow, with another presence in the house. It had been years since he'd shared his morning with anyone. As he cracked eggs into a pan, his mind wandered to Shadow, his canine partner. The German Shepherd in his kitchen brought back memories he'd tried hard to suppress. Shadow's unwavering loyalty, their countless patrols together, that final desperate night. The sound of gunfire still echoed in his dreams sometimes. Jack glanced at the dog, who watched him intently from the corner. "You're not him," he said softly, "but you sure remind me of him." The toast popped up with a sharp click that made the dog's ears twitch. Jack smiled despite himself. He'd always appreciated how alert German Shepherds were. It had saved his life more than once when Shadow was his partner. As he sat down to eat, memories of Sarah flooded back too. She used to tease him about his simple breakfast choices, always trying to get him to try something more adventurous. "Life's too short for plain toast, Jack," she'd say, her eyes twinkling. Then the illness came, swift and merciless, and suddenly life really was too short. The kitchen had felt empty ever since. After finishing his breakfast, Jack turned his attention to his unexpected guest. The dog needed drying properly. His coat was still damp from the snow, and Jack couldn't have him catching a chill. He found an old towel in the bathroom and approached slowly, not wanting to startle the animal. "Come here, boy," he called softly. The dog hesitated for a moment before padding over to him. Jack began gently drying him off, noting how the dog leaned into his touch, clearly used to human handling. This wasn't a stray. Someone had cared for him. As Jack worked the towel around the dog's neck, his fingers brushed against something tucked into the collar. Frowning, he carefully pulled out a folded piece of paper, dampened but still readable. The dog watched as Jack unfolded it, tail wagging slightly. Jack's throat tightened as he read the note aloud. "Please, whoever finds him, take care of him. His name is Bear. I love him, but I had no choice. Please keep him safe. Emily." The words hung in the air between them. Bear. At least now he had a name for his visitor. But the note raised more questions than it answered. Jack read it again, trying to understand what could drive someone to abandon a beloved pet in such dangerous conditions. "Emily," he said the name slowly, looking at Bear. "What happened to you and Emily, boy?" Anger started to build in his chest, not at Emily exactly, but at the situation. As a cop, he'd seen too many cases of abandoned animals, but this felt different. The note spoke of love and desperation, not callousness. Jack reached for his phone and dialed the local animal shelter. After several rings, a tired-sounding woman answered. "Valley Animal Shelter, how can I help you?" "Hi, I found a German Shepherd in the storm last night. He's got a collar, but just a note, no tags. Wondering if you have space?" The woman sighed. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're completely full. The storm brought in too many strays already. We can't take any more animals right now." "There's really nothing you can do?" Jack pressed. "Unless you want to leave him on our doorstep, which I strongly advise against, there's nothing we can do. It's a lost cause right now. Try again in a few weeks." Jack thanked her and hung up, looking at Bear, who had settled back by the fireplace. The dog's eyes met his, and Jack saw something there. Trust, maybe, or hope. It stirred something in his chest he thought had died, with Sarah and Shadow. "Guess you're stuck with me," he muttered, running a hand through his gray-streaked hair. Bear's tail thumped against the floor at the sound of his voice. Jack glanced at the clock on the wall, just past 9. The vet's office would be open now, and Bear needed checking over after his ordeal in the storm. But as Jack made plans for the visit, his thoughts kept returning to the note and its writer. Emily. Someone out there had loved this dog enough to write that note, to hope for his safety even while being forced to let him go. The storm had been fierce, dangerous enough to kill. Was she out there somewhere? What had driven her to such a desperate act? Bear whined softly, as if sensing Jack's troubled thoughts. The sound brought him back to the present, to the immediate needs of the animal in his care. Tomorrow, he'd take Bear to the vet, but for now, his mind was filled with questions about Emily and the story behind the note tucked in Bear's collar. The soft whimper pierced through Jack's dreamless sleep, pulling him reluctantly into consciousness. His eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the darkness of his bedroom. Another whine, more insistent this time, drew his attention to Bear, who paced anxiously by the door. The red numbers on his bedside clock glowed accusingly. 2:30 a.m. "What is it, boy?" Jack mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. He pushed himself up on his elbows, watching as Bear continued his restless movement. The dog's behavior seemed different from a typical nighttime bathroom need. There was an urgency in his movements that made Jack's old police instincts stir. Bear's nails clicked against the wooden floor as he moved back and forth, his whines growing more frequent. The sound reminded Jack of Shadow, how his former partner would act when he'd caught the scent of something important during their patrols. That same focused intensity showed in Bear's eyes now, visible even in the dim light filtering through the window. Jack swung his legs over the side of the bed, the cold floor shocking his bare feet. All right, he grumbled, reaching for his boots. What's got you so worked up?" The moment Jack's feet touched the floor, Bear's behavior intensified. The dog rushed to him, then back to the door, his whole body vibrating with nervous energy. Jack had seen this before. This wasn't just restlessness. Bear was trying to tell him something. As Jack pulled on his boots, memories of similar nights with Shadow flooded back. Nights when his partner's instincts had led them to people in trouble, to crimes in progress, to lives that needed saving. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, heavy as the winter coat he now reached for. When Jack finally opened the door, Bear bolted into the darkness. The storm had picked up again, wind howling through the trees, and snow swirling in thick curtains. "Bear!" Jack called out, his voice swallowed by the wind. The dog paused briefly at the edge of the porch, looking back with an almost human expression of impatience. "Damn it!" Jack muttered, hurrying after the dog. The cold hit him like a physical blow, making him wish he'd grabbed his heavier coat. Snow crunched under his boots as he followed Bear's dark form through the swirling white. Bear moved with purpose, stopping occasionally to ensure Jack was following before pressing on. The wind cut through Jack's clothes, and snow collected in his hair and eyelashes. His face burned from the cold, and his fingers were already growing numb despite his gloves. "Where are you taking me?" he called out, but Bear just continued forward, his tail straight and focused. The dog's behavior triggered something in Jack's mind, the note in Bear's collar signed by Emily. The pieces started falling into place. Bear's desperate behavior, his determination to head out into the storm. "Someone's out there," Jack realized aloud, his words carried away by the wind. "Emily's out there." The thought of someone trapped in this weather sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cold. He'd seen what winter storms could do to people caught unprepared. He'd recovered enough bodies during his years on the force to know exactly how dangerous this situation could be. Bear led him deeper into the woods, away from the safety of his cabin. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. Jack's legs burned from trudging through the deep drifts, and his breathing came in harsh pants that frosted in the air before him. The wind seemed to grow stronger with each step, driving needle-sharp ice crystals into any exposed skin. Jack pulled his collar higher, squinting through the darkness. Bear was just ahead, a darker shadow against the swirling white, still moving with that same desperate purpose. "I can't let anyone die out here," Jack muttered through clenched teeth, drawing his coat tighter around himself. The words felt like a promise. To himself, to Bear, to the mysterious Emily who had written that note. He thought of Shadow, of all the times they'd searched through weather like this, looking for lost hikers or runaway kids. He thought of Sarah, and how she'd always supported his need to help others, even when it meant leaving their warm bed in the middle of the night. Bear stopped suddenly, turning to look at Jack with those intelligent eyes. The dog's dark fur was dusted with snow, making him look almost ghostly in the darkness. Jack could see the determination in Bear's stance, the urgent need to keep moving forward. "All right, boy," Jack said, steeling himself against the cold. "Lead the way." With one final glance at Bear's resolute form, he pulled his coat tighter and pressed on into the howling night, following the dog deeper into the storm. The wind screamed around them, but Jack was focused now, his old training kicking in. Somewhere out in this brutal weather, someone needed help, and despite everything, his grief, his isolation, his reluctance to get involved, he couldn't turn back now. The storm raged on, unforgiving in its intensity, as Jack and Bear continued their desperate search through the darkness. Snow continued to fall heavily, obscuring their vision and making each step a challenge. But Bear pressed forward, and Jack followed, driven by a determination he hadn't felt in years. The morning sun struggled to break through the heavy clouds as Jack trudged through the deep snow, his legs burning with exhaustion. Bear moved ahead of him, pulling steadily on the leash despite the hours they'd spent searching. Jack's breath came out in white puffs, his face numb from the biting cold. They'd been out here for hours, and his body screamed for rest. "Bear, we need to—" Jack's voice trailed off as something caught his eye. There, partially hidden beneath a fresh layer of snow, were footprints, human footprints. His heart quickened as he knelt down to examine them more closely. They were small, likely belonging to a woman, and despite the fresh snowfall trying to erase them, they were still visible enough to follow. "Good boy," Jack muttered, patting Bear's head. The dog's tail wagged slightly, his dark eyes fixed on the direction the footprints led. Jack straightened up, ignoring the protest in his joints. His police training kicked in as he studied the pattern of the tracks. They weren't straight. They weaved slightly, as if whoever made them had been struggling to walk. They followed the trail through the quiet streets of the small town. Most businesses were still closed, their windows dark and uninviting. Bear stopped occasionally, nose to the ground, sniffing intently before moving forward with renewed purpose. Jack trusted the dog's instincts. They'd saved countless lives during his years on the force. After about 20 minutes, they came upon a 24-hour diner, its neon sign casting a warm glow on the snow-covered sidewalk. Through the window, Jack could see a few early morning customers nursing cups of coffee. Bear pulled toward the entrance, his tail wagging with more enthusiasm. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, and warm air hit Jack's face like a welcome embrace. An older waitress looked up from behind the counter, her eyebrows raising slightly at the sight of the German Shepherd. "Can I help you?" she asked, already reaching for a coffee pot. Jack approached the counter, keeping a firm hold on Bear's leash. "I'm looking for someone," he said, his voice rough from the cold. "A young woman named Emily." The waitress's hand paused mid-pour, recognition flickering across her weathered face. "Emily?" She set down the coffee pot and wiped her hands on her apron. "Yeah, she was here a couple nights ago." Jack leaned forward, hope rising in his chest. "What can you tell me about her?" The waitress's face softened with concern. "Poor thing looked awful sick. Pale as a ghost, barely touched her food." She shook her head, picking up a towel and absently wiping the counter. "She left in quite a hurry, too. Muttered something about not making it. Worried me sick. But she was gone, before I could say anything." Jack studied the woman's face, noting the genuine worry in her eyes. "Did she mention where she was headed? Any idea at all?" "Well," the waitress hesitated, her brow furrowed in thought. "She didn't say exactly, but—" She glanced toward the window in the direction of the town's outskirts. "There's a motel down that way, the Pine Grove. Not the nicest place, but it's cheap. I saw her walking that direction after she left." Jack's police instincts tingled. "The Pine Grove Motel? You're sure?" The waitress nodded, her eyes filled with sadness. "That's right. Listen, if you find her—" She paused, wringing the towel in her hands. "Make sure she's okay. Something wasn't right with that girl." "I will," Jack promised, already turning toward the door. "Thank you." Back outside, the wind had picked up, sending swirls of snow across their path. Bear seemed more determined than ever, pulling Jack in the direction of the motel. They walked for another 10 minutes before the Pine Grove Motel came into view. A rundown 2-story building with peeling paint and flickering vacancy sign. As they approached, Bear's behavior changed dramatically. He pulled harder on the leash, his whole body trembling with urgency. Jack felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Something about this place felt wrong, and years of police work had taught him to trust his gut. The motel office was small and dimly lit, with yellowed wallpaper and the strong smell of cigarette smoke. A sleepy-looking clerk glanced up from his phone as Jack entered, Bear practically dragging him to the counter. "I need information about one of your guests," Jack said, his voice firm with authority. "A young woman named Emily. She would have checked in within the last couple of days." The clerk straightened up, looking between Jack and Bear with suspicious eyes. "Can't give out guest information." Jack pulled out his old police badge. Retired or not, still carried weight. "This is a matter of life and death. I need to know if she's here and what room she's in." The clerk's resistance crumbled under Jack's intense stare. He turned to his computer, typing slowly. "Yeah, okay. Emily Wilson, checked in 3 days ago, paid cash for a week." He squinted at the screen. "Room 217, second floor." Jack's heart pounded as he headed for the stairs, Bear leading the way. The motel's second-floor walkway creaked under their feet, and the wind whistled through gaps in the walls. Something was very wrong. He could feel it in his bones, the same way he used to feel it during his most dangerous cases. Bear stopped in front of room 217, his whole body rigid with tension. Jack stood there for a moment, staring at the peeling numbers on the door, knowing that whatever waited on the other side would change everything. The neon vacancy sign buzzed and flickered weakly against the gray morning sky as Jack pulled into the motel's nearly empty parking lot. Snow was starting to fall again, thick flakes swirling down from heavy clouds. The 2-story building looked like it had seen better days, with peeling paint and rusty railings along the upper walkway. A few lonely cars sat scattered across the lot, partially buried under fresh snow. Bear whined softly from the passenger seat, his nose pressed against the window. Jack cut the engine and sat for a moment, watching his breath fog up the windshield. The exhaustion of their long search weighed heavily on his shoulders, but something kept pushing him forward. Maybe it was the police officer in him, or maybe it was something else. A need to understand why someone would abandon their dog in a deadly storm. "All right, boy," Jack said, patting Bear's head. "Let's check it out." They climbed out of the truck, and Bear immediately put his nose to the ground, sniffing intently near the entrance. His tail wagged with renewed energy, and Jack felt a spark of hope. The German Shepherd clearly recognized something familiar. The office door had a crooked "open" sign hanging in the window. Jack knocked, his knuckles rapping against the cold glass. After a few moments, he heard shuffling footsteps from inside. The door creaked open, revealing a man in his 60s with thinning gray hair and deep circles under his eyes. He wore a worn flannel shirt and carried the weary expression of someone who'd seen too many troubled guests come and go. "Can I help you?" the owner asked, his voice rough with sleep. Jack cleared his throat. "Yes, I'm looking for information about a guest who might have stayed here recently. A young woman named Emily." The owner's eyes narrowed slightly, darting between Jack and Bear. "You police?" "Former police," Jack admitted, "but this is personal. I'm trying to help someone who might be in trouble." The owner hesitated, then stepped back, gesturing for Jack to come inside. The small office smelled of coffee and cigarettes, with the ancient desk fan spinning lazily in the corner. The owner moved behind the counter and pulled out a thick guest register. "Let me check," he mumbled, flipping through the pages. His finger traced down several columns of handwritten entries. "Yeah, had a young woman check in 2 nights ago. Didn't give a last name, just Emily." Jack leaned forward. "What can you tell me about her?" The owner's brow furrowed as he recalled the details. "She wasn't in good shape. Pale, shaking. Thought she might be sick or something. Paid cash for 1 night, but she was gone before dawn." He paused, scratching his chin. Strange thing was, she kept mumbling to herself about not being able to make it. Seemed real upset about something. Did she say where she was headed? Jack asked, trying to keep the urgency out of his voice. Nah, didn't leave any forwarding address or nothing, just disappeared. The owner shrugged. Get all types here, you know how it is. Some folks don't want to be found. Jack nodded, understanding all too well. Which room was she in? Room 115, ground floor. The owner pointed through the window. But we already cleaned it out. Nothing left behind. Jack thanked the owner and headed back outside with Bear, who was already pulling toward the row of ground floor rooms. They made their way around the building, checking every corner and shadow. The snow was falling harder now, erasing any tracks that might have been left behind. As they reached the narrow alley behind the motel, Bear's behavior suddenly changed. His ears perked up, and he began whining, pulling Jack towards something half buried in the snow. Jack's heart beat faster as he knelt down and brushed away the powder, revealing a dirty wool scarf. Bear sniffed it eagerly, his tail wagging with recognition. The dog's whining grew more insistent, and he pawed at the ground near the scarf. Jack picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It was cheap but warm, the kind of thing someone might grab in a hurry when they had few options. The German Shepherd's reaction told Jack everything he needed to know. This belonged to Emily. She had been here suffering from some illness, and now she was out there somewhere in the growing storm. But where? Bear continued to pull at the leash, clearly agitated by the scent. Jack felt his determination hardening into resolve. They were close. He could feel it. The woman who had written that heartbreaking note about Bear was real, and she needed help. He couldn't walk away now, not when they might be her only chance. Standing up with the scarf in his hand, Jack watched Bear's desperate attempts to follow what must be Emily's trail. The dog's loyalty, even after being abandoned, struck a chord in Jack's heart. It reminded him of Shadow, of the unbreakable bond between handler and dog. Whatever had made Emily leave Bear behind, Jack was certain it hadn't been an easy choice. The snow continued to fall around them, and Jack tucked the scarf into his pocket. His muscles ached from the hours of searching, but he pushed the fatigue aside. Somewhere in this town, a young woman was alone and sick, carrying a burden he didn't yet understand. The ex-cop in him couldn't ignore someone in trouble, and the part of him that was still grieving recognized another soul in pain. The wind howled through the narrow alley as Jack followed Bear's determined lead. Dirty snow crunched under his boots, and his fingers had gone numb despite his thick gloves. The German Shepherd moved with purpose, his nose working overtime as he pulled Jack deeper into the shadows between the buildings. "Easy, boy," Jack muttered, but Bear wouldn't slow down. The dog's urgency made Jack's heart pound faster. 20 years on the force had taught him to trust a dog's instincts. The alley stretched behind several buildings, creating a maze of dumpsters and forgotten debris. Old newspapers skittered across the ground, caught in the bitter wind. Jack's police training kicked in as he scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement or life in this desolate place. Bear suddenly jerked harder on the leash, nearly pulling Jack off his feet. The dog's whine grew more intense, more desperate. Jack could see his breath coming in quick, white puffs as he struggled to keep up with Bear's pace. "What is it, boy?" "What did you find?" They rounded a corner where two buildings met, creating a shadowy alcove. A large green dumpster sat against the brick wall, surrounded by scattered trash and snowdrifts. Bear made a beeline for it, circling to the back side. That's when Jack saw her. His heart stopped for a moment as his eyes registered the crumpled form half buried in the snow. A young woman lay there, curled into herself as if trying to preserve what little warmth she had left. Her skin was frighteningly pale, with a bluish tint that made Jack's blood run cold. "Oh God," he breathed, dropping to his knees beside her. His training took over as he pressed two fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. The skin was ice cold under his touch. For a terrible moment, he felt nothing. Then, there it was, faint and irregular, but present. A weak flutter of life still pulsed beneath his fingers. Bear whined and nudged the woman's face with his nose. Jack noticed how the dog's entire body trembled, not from cold, but from worry for his owner. This had to be Emily. "She's alive, boy," Jack assured him, though his voice was tight with concern. "But barely." He quickly shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around Emily's still form. Her clothes were completely soaked through from the snow, and Jack knew hypothermia had likely set in hours ago. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, too shallow, too slow. "Come on, Emily," he muttered, carefully sliding one arm under her knees and the other behind her shoulders. "Stay with me." As he lifted her, she felt terrifyingly light in his arms. Her head lolled against his chest, dark hair falling across her face. Jack could feel how cold she was even through his layers of clothing. Bear danced anxiously around them as Jack carried Emily back through the alley, his paws leaving frantic prints in the fresh snow. The dog's worried whines echoed off the brick walls. "It's okay, boy," Jack said between labored breaths. "We've got her now." The walk back to his truck felt endless. Each step was careful but urgent, trying to move quickly without jostling Emily too much. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes catching in her hair and on her eyelashes. Her face looked peaceful, almost like she was sleeping, but Jack knew better. This kind of peaceful sleep could be deadly. When they finally reached his truck, Jack had to shift Emily carefully to one arm while he fumbled with the door handle. Bear jumped into the back seat first, and Jack gently laid Emily across the seat, her head resting in Bear's lap. The dog immediately curled around her, trying to share his warmth. Jack cranked the heat up to full blast as he started the engine. His hand shook as he turned the truck around, pointing it toward the hospital. The roads were getting worse by the minute, covered in fresh snow that concealed patches of ice underneath. "Hang on," he whispered, more to himself than to his unconscious passenger. "Just hang on." In the rearview mirror, he could see Bear watching over Emily, occasionally nuzzling her face or whimpering softly. The dog's loyalty made Jack's chest tight with emotion. After being abandoned in the storm, Bear had never given up on finding his owner. The truck's tires slipped slightly as Jack took a corner, and he gripped the steering wheel tighter. The windshield wipers worked furiously against the falling snow, but visibility was getting worse. The hospital was on the other side of town, normally a 15-minute drive, but in these conditions it would take longer. Emily hadn't moved or made a sound since he found her. Jack kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of consciousness. Her breathing remained shallow, her face still deathly pale. The truck's heater roared at full power, but Jack knew it wouldn't be enough to counter the deep cold that had settled into her body. "Stay with us, Emily," he muttered, pressing down harder on the accelerator. "Just stay with us." Bear's worried whine from the back seat seemed to echo Jack's own fears as they raced through the storm, hoping they weren't too late. The emergency room doors burst open with a whoosh of cold air as Jack stumbled in, carrying Emily's limp form. Her skin was pale as paper, her lips tinged with blue. "Help!" he called out, his voice cracking. "Please, she needs help." The medical staff responded instantly. 2 nurses rushed forward with a gurney, while a doctor in blue scrubs appeared seemingly out of nowhere. Jack gently laid Emily down, his arms trembling from the effort of carrying her through the storm. Her dark hair was matted with snow, and her clothes were soaked through. "What happened?" the doctor asked sharply, already checking Emily's vital signs. "Found her in an alley," Jack explained, his breath coming in short gasps. "She's been out in the storm. She's barely breathing." The medical team worked with practiced efficiency, hooking Emily up to various machines. One nurse inserted an IV while another attached oxygen tubes to Emily's nose. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the air, weak but present. Bear sat quietly at Jack's feet, his brown eyes fixed on Emily. His fur was still damp from the snow, but he made no move to shake it off. Instead, he pressed closer to Jack's leg, offering silent support. Jack could only watch helplessly as the medical team worked. His police training had prepared him for many things, but this feeling of powerlessness was overwhelming. He found himself mentally replaying the events that had led him here, the note in Bear's collar, the search through the storm, finding Emily's nearly lifeless body behind that dumpster. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the doctor approached Jack. His face was serious as he gestured for Jack to follow him a few steps away from the bed. "I'm Dr. Matthews," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Can you tell me anything about her medical history?" Jack shook his head. "Nothing. I just found her tonight. Her name is Emily. That's all I know." The doctor nodded, making a note on his clipboard. "Well, she's suffering from severe pneumonia and malnutrition. Her body temperature was dangerously low when you brought her in. If you hadn't found her when you did—" He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "She wouldn't have survived the night." Jack's stomach churned with guilt and fear. He thought about the note in Bear's collar, about Emily's desperate decision to abandon her dog. How long had she been suffering? What circumstances had driven her to such extremes? "What are her chances?" Jack asked, his voice rough. "Her condition is critical," Dr. Matthews replied honestly. "The next 24 hours will be crucial. We're giving her antibiotics for the pneumonia and working to bring her temperature up slowly. We'll do everything we can, but—" He trailed off, his expression grave. Jack looked over at Emily's still form on the hospital bed. She seemed so small and vulnerable under the harsh fluorescent lights, surrounded by beeping machines and tangled in tubes and wires. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, each one seeming like a struggle. The doctor squeezed Jack's shoulder briefly before leaving to attend to other patients. Jack stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over him like a heavy blanket. Then, moving slowly, he made his way to the chair beside Emily's bed and sank into it. Bear followed faithfully, lying down at Jack's feet with a soft whimper. The dog's eyes never left Emily's face, and Jack could feel the tension radiating from his furry companion. The room fell quiet except for the steady beeping of the monitors and the soft hiss of the oxygen. Jack leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and studied Emily's face. In the harsh hospital lighting, he could see the hollows in her cheeks, the dark circles under her eyes. How long had she been sick? How long had she been alone? His mind wandered back to Sarah, his wife, and how quickly illness had taken her. He remembered the helplessness, the anger, the crushing weight of watching someone slip away while being unable to do anything about it. Now here he was again, sitting beside another hospital bed, watching another life hang in the balance. But this time was different. This time, he'd found her in time. This time, maybe he could make a difference. Bear shifted slightly, resting his chin on Jack's shoe. The simple gesture of comfort made Jack's throat tight with emotion. He reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, grateful for the warm presence at his feet. Hours passed slowly in the quiet room. Nurses came and went, checking vitals and adjusting medications. Jack remained in his chair, unable to leave, trying to make sense of what he'd gotten himself into. He didn't know this woman, didn't owe her anything, and yet here he sat, holding vigil beside her bed as if she were family. Maybe it was because of Bear's unwavering loyalty. Maybe it was because of the desperate words in that note. Or maybe it was because Jack recognized something in Emily's situation that spoke to his own broken past. The loneliness, the desperation, the need for someone to care enough to help. Whatever the reason, Jack knew he couldn't walk away now. He'd found her for a reason, and he intended to see it through. As the morning light began to creep through the hospital windows, Jack settled deeper into his uncomfortable chair, prepared to wait as long as necessary for Emily to wake up. Bear dozed fitfully at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to check on Emily before settling back down. The loyal dog's presence was a comfort in the sterile hospital room, a reminder of the strange chain of events that had brought them all together. Sunlight filtered through the hospital room's thin curtains, casting pale shadows across Emily's face as she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding her features as she took in her unfamiliar surroundings. The steady beep of monitors filled the silence. Jack sat up straighter in his chair, relief washing over him. "You're awake," he said softly. Emily's eyes darted around the room, panic rising in her expression as reality settled in. When her gaze landed on Jack, something shifted. Confusion turned to anger, her jaw clenching tight. "Why did you save me?" The words came out in a harsh whisper, her voice raw from disuse. Her hands gripped the thin hospital blanket until her knuckles turned white. "You should have just taken care of Bear." Jack blinked, caught off guard by the venom in her voice. He stood up, his own frustration building. "What was I supposed to do? Leave you to freeze to death?" "Yes," Emily's voice cracked. "That's exactly what you should have done. I didn't ask for your help." Bear, who had been dozing at Jack's feet, lifted his head at the raised voices. His ears twitched forward, attention moving between Emily and Jack. "You don't get to just give up on life," Jack fired back, his voice rising to match hers. "You don't get to abandon your dog in a snowstorm and expect everyone else to clean up after you." Emily's face flushed with anger. "You don't know anything about me. You have no right to judge my choices." "I know enough," Jack said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I know you left Bear with a note, hoping someone would find him. I know you were ready to die alone in that alley." "Because I have nothing left." Emily's words echoed off the sterile walls. "Don't you understand? I have nothing. No family, no future, nothing. I don't deserve to be saved." Jack's own grief surged to the surface, coloring his words with raw emotion. "You think you're the only one who's lost everything. Who's felt that kind of emptiness?" Emily fell silent, studying his face. "I understand loneliness," Jack continued, his voice quieter but still intense. "I understand wanting to give up. My wife died 3 years ago, and my canine partner before that. I know what it's like to feel like there's nothing left to live for." "Then you should understand why I wanted to end it," Emily said, but some of the fight had left her voice. "What I understand is that giving up isn't the answer," Jack replied. "It's the easy way out, but it's not the right choice." "Easy?" Emily's laugh was bitter. "You think what I'm going through is easy?" "No," Jack said firmly, "but throwing your life away is easier than fighting to live, easier than facing whatever you're running from." Emily turned away, her shoulders tense. "You don't know what I'm facing." "Then tell me," Jack challenged. "Help me understand why you'd abandon Bear, who clearly loves you enough to lead me through a blizzard to save your life." At the mention of his name, Bear stood up and padded over to Emily's bedside. He nudged her hand gently with his nose, his tail wagging slightly. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She didn't look at Jack, but her fingers curled into Bear's fur. I thought he'd be better off without me. Everyone is." "That's not true," Jack said, watching as Bear pressed closer to Emily. "Look at him. Does he look like he's better off without you?" Emily's lower lip trembled as she finally looked at Bear. The German shepherd's brown eyes were fixed on her face, full of unconditional love. Despite her earlier anger, she didn't pull away when he licked her hand. Jack sat down heavily in the chair beside her bed. The weight of the conversation pressed down on him, reminding him of his own battles with grief and loneliness. The room felt quiet, except for the steady beeping of monitors and Bear's soft panting. Emily remained turned away, but Jack could see the subtle shift in her posture. The rigid anger had softened, replaced by something more vulnerable. She didn't speak, but her hand stayed buried in Bear's fur, holding on like an anchor in a storm. Jack watched them silently, knowing he'd struck a nerve. The crack in Emily's emotional armor was small, but it was there. He'd seen it in the way her eyes had softened when Bear approached, in the slight tremor of her hand as she touched him. Bear settled himself half on the bed, his head resting near Emily's hip. His presence seemed to ease some of the tension in the room, though the aftermath of their argument still hung heavy in the air. Jack leaned back in his chair, uncertain what to say next. He knew he needed to get through to her somehow, but the right words eluded him. For now, he let the silence stretch between them, watching as Bear's steady presence did what his words couldn't, offer comfort without judgment. The minutes ticked by slowly. Emily's breathing gradually steadied, though she kept her face turned away. Jack could see tears tracking silently down her cheek, but he pretended not to notice, giving her what privacy he could in the small hospital room. Bear's tail thumped softly against the bed, a quiet reminder that whatever happened next, none of them were truly alone. The evening sky had cleared, revealing a canvas of stars above Jack's cabin as he pulled into the driveway. Bear sat quietly in the passenger seat, his breath fogging up the window. The events of the day weighed heavily on Jack's mind as he killed the engine, letting silence settle around them. "Come on, boy," Jack muttered, opening his door. The cold air bit at his face as he stepped out. Bear followed, his paws crunching in the fresh snow. Inside the cabin, Jack shrugged off his heavy coat and hung it by the door. The emptiness of the space felt different tonight, more pronounced somehow. Maybe it was because of Emily's words echoing in his head. Or maybe it was the way her pain had stirred something inside him he'd been trying to ignore. Jack moved to the fireplace, methodically arranging logs and kindling. His movements were automatic, practiced from years of living alone. As flames began to dance across the wood, he settled into his familiar armchair, reaching for the bottle of whiskey on the side table. The amber liquid swirled in his glass, catching the firelight. Bear curled up at his feet, a warm presence against the chill that seemed to seep into Jack's bones. Not just from the weather, from something deeper. "What am I doing?" he whispered to the quiet room. Emily's anger, her determination to push him away. It all felt too familiar, like looking in a mirror and seeing his own reflection from years ago. Jack took a slow sip, letting the whiskey burn down his throat. His mind drifted back to Sarah, her laugh, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, how she'd always known exactly what to say when he came home after a rough day on the force. The memory of her final days in the hospital still cut like a knife, sharp and merciless. And Shadow, his loyal partner through countless patrols and dangerous situations. The day they lost him still played out in Jack's mind with cruel clarity. The shootout, the split-second decision that went wrong, the way Shadow had given his life protecting Jack. Two devastating losses, so close together, had left Jack adrift in an ocean of grief. He closed his eyes, remembering how he'd pushed everyone away after that. friends, family, colleagues, anyone who tried to help. He'd convinced himself it was better that way, safer, just like Emily was doing now. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" Jack murmured, looking down at Bear. The dog's eyes met his, full of understanding that seemed to go beyond what any animal should possess. Bear had seen it too, the same emptiness in Emily that Jack carried within himself. Jack set his glass down, the whiskey barely touched. His fingers found Bear's fur, stroking the soft coat that had been matted and frozen just days ago. The simple act of petting Bear brought a comfort he hadn't expected, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling nearby. It struck him then, watching Bear's steady breathing, how the dog had refused to give up on Emily even when she'd tried to send him away. Maybe that's what they both needed, someone stubborn enough to stay, even when pushed away. Someone who understood that sometimes the people who fight help the hardest are the ones who need it most. Bear shifted, placing his head on Jack's lap. The weight was grounding, real. Jack felt something stir in his chest. Not quite hope, but maybe it's beginning. A crack in the walls he'd built around himself. "You're right," he said softly to Bear. "We can't let her do this alone." The words felt strange in his mouth, but true. He'd spent so long convincing himself that isolation was the answer, that pushing people away would somehow make the pain more bearable. But watching Emily try to do the same thing, it showed him how wrong he'd been. Jack leaned back in his chair, his hand still resting on Bear's head. The fire popped and crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel like a fortress keeping the world out. Instead, it felt like a reminder of how lonely he'd allowed himself to become. Bear's tail thumped against the floor, a gentle rhythm that seemed to say he understood. Jack smiled slightly, remembering how this dog had shown up at his door just days ago, as if sent by some higher power that knew they all needed each other. "We'll go back tomorrow," Jack decided, speaking to Bear but really talking to himself. "She needs to know she's not alone in this." He knew it wouldn't be easy. Emily's defenses were strong, built from whatever pain had driven her to abandon Bear and give up on herself. But Jack recognized those defenses because he'd built the same ones. Standing up, Jack moved to the window. The storm had left everything covered in a blanket of pristine snow, untouched and peaceful. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But for now, he felt more centered than he had in years. Bear padded over to join him, pressing against his leg in silent support. Jack checked his watch, knowing he should try to get some rest before returning to the hospital. But first, he needed to figure out what to say to Emily, how to make her understand that he saw through her anger because he'd lived it himself, that sometimes the hardest step toward healing was letting someone else in. The morning sun cast long shadows through the hospital window as Jack made his way down the sterile corridor. His footsteps echoed against the linoleum floors, matching the steady rhythm of his heart. Bear padded quietly beside him, his nails clicking softly with each step. When they reached Emily's room, Jack paused at the doorway. Emily sat propped up in her bed, her gaze fixed on the world outside her window. The morning light highlighted the pallor of her skin and the dark circles under her eyes. She looked fragile, like a porcelain doll that might shatter at the slightest touch. Bear's tail wagged gently as he recognized Emily, but even he seemed to sense the heaviness in the air. He moved quietly to the foot of her bed and settled down, his brown eyes watching both humans with careful attention. Jack cleared his throat softly as he entered. "Morning," he said, keeping his voice low and gentle. Emily didn't turn to look at him, but her shoulders tensed slightly, acknowledging his presence. He settled into the chair beside her bed, the plastic creaking under his weight. The silence between them felt thick, almost tangible. Jack studied her profile, noting how she seemed to be looking past the window, past the buildings and trees, into some distant place he couldn't see. "Why are you here?" Emily finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She still didn't look at him. Jack leaned forward in his chair, resting his elbows on his knees. "I think you know why," he replied. "Something's not right here, Emily. And I'm not talking about finding you in that alley." She flinched slightly at his words, her fingers moving to trace the edge of her blanket. The movement was repetitive, almost compulsive, as if she needed something to ground herself. "You're pushing everyone away," Jack continued, his voice firm but kind. "Me, the nurses, even Bear sometimes. I want to know why." Emily's fingers stilled on the blanket. The morning light caught the tears welling in her eyes, though she blinked them away quickly. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "It matters," Jack insisted. "It matters to Bear, and it matters to me." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "You don't even know me, Jack. You found me in an alley, that's all. You did your good deed. You can go now." "Is that what you think this is? A good deed?" Jack felt frustration rising in his chest. "I didn't save you just to watch you give up." Her head snapped toward him then, eyes blazing with a sudden fury. "Give up?" she spat. "You think I'm giving up?" Bear lifted his head at her tone, ears perked forward with concern. Jack held her gaze steadily, waiting. The anger seemed to drain from her as quickly as it had come. Her shoulders slumped, and she looked down at her hands, now twisted in her lap. The silence stretched between them again, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Emily took a shaky breath. "I'm dying, Jack." The words fell from her lips like stones, heavy and final. "I have a terminal illness. I've been sick for a while, but there's no hope left. No money, no family. I don't even have a reason to fight anymore." The truth hit Jack like a physical blow. He'd suspected something was seriously wrong, but hearing it confirmed made his chest tighten painfully. He watched as a tear rolled down Emily's cheek, dropping silently onto the blanket. Bear whined softly, sensing the shift in emotion. He moved from his spot at the foot of the bed, pressing his head gently against Emily's leg. The gesture seemed to break something in her, and her shoulders began to shake with silent sobs. Jack struggled to find his voice, to find the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "What about Bear?" he asked, gesturing to the dog who remained steadfastly by her side. "What about him?" Emily turned away again, but not before Jack caught the flash of pain across her face. Bear pressed closer to her, and she absently reached down to touch his fur. Her entire body seemed to cave in on itself, as if the weight of her confession was physically crushing her. The morning sun continued to stream through the window, creating patterns on the hospital floor. The steady beep of monitors and the distant sounds of the hospital faded into background noise as Jack watched Emily struggle with her emotions. Bear remained pressed against her, offering silent comfort in the way only animals can. In that moment, Jack saw it clearly. Bear wasn't just a dog she'd abandoned in a storm. He was her last connection to hope, to life itself. Despite her words about having no reason to fight, Bear's presence was the thread she was still holding on to, however tenuously. The realization made Jack's heart ache. He understood now why she'd left that note in Bear's collar, why she'd made sure someone would find him and keep him safe. She'd been trying to secure a future for the one being who had stayed by her side, even as she prepared to give up on her own. The morning sunlight filtered through the hospital window, casting long shadows across the sterile floor. Jack had just stepped out to grab some coffee when he caught movement from the corner of his eye. His heart skipped a beat as he saw Emily standing by the door, her hospital gown hanging loosely on her frail frame. Her fingers trembled as they gripped the door handle, her knuckles white with determination. Bear, who had been dozing in the corner, lifted his head and whined softly. The sound drew Jack's attention to Emily's face, hollow-cheeked and pale, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. But it was the look of utter despair in her gaze that made his breath catch in his throat. "Emily," he called out softly, not wanting to startle her. "What are you doing?" She didn't turn to face him, but her shoulders tensed. "I can't stay here anymore, Jack. I can't." Jack moved closer, his steps measured and careful, as if approaching a wounded animal. "You're not leaving. You're fighting this, Emily, whether you want to or not." His voice was firm but gentle, carrying the weight of someone who understood pain all too well. Emily's hand tightened on the door handle, but she made no move to open it. Her whole body trembled with exhaustion and something deeper, a bone-deep weariness that seemed to seep from her very soul. Jack reached out, his fingers wrapping gently but firmly around her arm. "You can't keep running, not this time." The words came out softer than he intended, heavy with understanding. The fight seemed to drain from Emily all at once. Her legs gave way and Jack caught her before she could fall, helping her back to the bed. She sank onto the mattress, tears streaming down her face, leaving silvery tracks on her pale cheeks. "I'm so tired, Jack," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm scared. So scared of dying alone, of being forgotten." The words tumbled out between quiet sobs, each one a confession she'd been holding back for too long. Bear padded over to the bed, resting his head on Emily's knee. His warm brown eyes watched her with unwavering devotion, and she absently ran her fingers through his fur. Jack sat beside her, taking her free hand in his. The warmth of his touch seemed to anchor her, keeping her from drifting away into the darkness of her thoughts. He took a deep breath, knowing it was time to share his own truth. "I've been there, Emily," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I know what it feels like to want to disappear." He paused, gathering his courage. "When I lost Sarah, my wife, and then Shadow, my K9 partner, I thought the world had ended. I wanted to fade away, to stop existing because existing hurt too much." Emily's tears slowed as she listened, her hand tightening slightly in his. "But you don't have to face it alone," Jack continued, his words raw and honest, laced with the pain of his own past. "You've got Bear, and you've got me." He squeezed her hand gently. "We'll fight together." Emily finally turned to look at him, really look at him. Her eyes, though red-rimmed from crying, held a tiny spark, the first glimmer of something that looked almost like hope. "I don't know if I can do it," she whispered. "You don't have to know right now," Jack replied. "Just stay. That's all I'm asking. Stay and let us help you." She didn't pull away when Jack kept holding her hand, and she didn't object when he settled into the chair beside her bed. Bear curled up at their feet, his steady presence a comfort to them both. The night stretched on, quiet except for the soft beeping of hospital machines and the occasional footsteps in the hallway. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching as darkness fell outside the window. Emily's breathing eventually steadied, and some of the tension left her shoulders. The wall she'd built around herself hadn't come down completely, but there was a crack in it now, a small opening that let in the first ray of hope. Over the next few days, Emily remained in the hospital. Jack visited regularly, bringing books, magazines, and sometimes just sitting with her, sharing comfortable silence or light conversation. Bear became a constant presence, his gentle nature and unwavering loyalty providing comfort when words weren't enough. Sometimes Emily would still get that distant look in her eyes, as if she were contemplating escape, but she stayed. Each day was a small victory, another step away from the edge she'd been teetering on. And though she never said it out loud, her eyes spoke volumes when Jack walked through the door each morning, Bear trotting faithfully at his side. Jack's cabin felt different with Emily in it. The usual emptiness that had haunted its rooms for years seemed to shift, replaced by a tense energy that crackled between its new occupants. Emily sat propped up on the couch, wrapped in blankets despite the warmth from the crackling fireplace. Her face was turned toward the window, watching snowflakes dance outside. "You need to eat something," Jack said, holding out a bowl of hot soup. The steam rose in gentle whisks, carrying the aroma of chicken and vegetables through the room. Emily's jaw tightened. "I'm not hungry." "The doctor said you need to keep your strength up." Jack's voice was firm, but gentle, remembering the hospital staff's instructions about Emily's care. "The doctor can't fix what's wrong with me," Emily snapped, her words sharp enough to make Bear's ears prick up from his spot by the fire. "So what's the point?" Jack set the bowl down on the coffee table with more force than necessary. "The point is, you're still here, still breathing. And as long as that's true, you're going to eat." Emily's eyes flashed. "You can't make me." "Watch me." Jack crossed his arms, planting himself in front of her with the stubborn determination that had made him a good cop. Bear got up from his spot and padded over to Emily, pressing his nose against her hand. The gesture seemed to deflate some of her anger. She looked down at the dog, her expression softening slightly. "Fine," she muttered, reaching for the soup. "But I'm doing this for Bear, not you." Jack bit back a retort, choosing instead to watch as she took small, reluctant spoonfuls. It was progress, even if it came with a healthy dose of attitude. The days fell into an uneasy routine. Emily spent most of her time either sleeping or staring out the window, speaking only when necessary. Jack tried to draw her out, but each attempt was met with resistance. "You can't just shut everyone out forever," he said one afternoon, frustration coloring his voice. "Why not?" Emily's laugh was bitter. "It's worked pretty well so far." "Has it?" Jack challenged. "Is that why I found you half frozen in an alley?" Emily's face paled, and Bear, sensing the tension, moved closer to her side. "That's not fair," she whispered. "None of this is fair," Jack agreed, his voice softening. "But pushing away people who want to help won't make it better." Emily turned away, but not before Jack caught the glimmer of tears in her eyes. She buried her face in Bear's fur, and the dog settled beside her, offering silent comfort. Later that evening, Jack overheard Emily talking to Bear when she thought he wasn't listening. Her voice was different then, softer, vulnerable. "I'm scared, Bear," she whispered. "I don't want to die alone, but I don't want to hurt anyone either. It's better if they don't care about me, isn't it?" Bear's only response was to snuggle closer, and Jack's heart ached at the raw pain in her voice. The breakthrough came gradually. Emily began eating without argument, even if she didn't finish her meals. She started asking Jack questions about his life, though she still deflected most questions about her own. And sometimes, when Bear did something particularly endearing, she would smile, brief flashes of warmth that transformed her entire face. Jack noticed these changes with quiet hope. He made calls, pulled strings from his old police connections, and finally secured an appointment with a specialist 2 towns over. "There's a doctor," he told Emily one evening. "Dr. Harrison. She's supposed to be one of the best in treating your condition." Emily's hands tightened around her tea mug. "Jack, I can't afford—" "Don't worry about that," he cut her off. Just, will you try? For Bear? He added the last part with a slight smile, knowing how she responded to that particular motivation. Emily looked down at Bear, who was watching her with those soulful eyes that seemed to understand everything. Her fingers absently stroked his fur as she considered Jack's words. When she finally looked up at Jack, something had changed in her expression. The wall she'd built around herself had cracked just enough to let a glimmer of hope shine through. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll try." Jack felt his chest tighten with relief. He watched as Emily turned back to Bear, whispering something in the dog's ear that made his tail wag. The sight of them together, the woman who'd given up on life and the dog who'd refused to give up on her, filled him with a fierce determination. As they began preparing for the journey to see the specialist, Jack noticed more subtle changes in Emily. She started asking questions about the treatment options, showing an interest in her own recovery that hadn't been there before. She even helped him map out the route, though the effort clearly exhausted her. Bear seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, staying close to Emily, but occasionally seeking out Jack as well, as if trying to bridge the gap between them. The dog's presence had become a constant source of comfort for both of them, a silent reminder that they weren't alone in this struggle. One evening, as Jack worked on arranging the final details for their trip, he glanced across the room to find Emily watching him. Her eyes held a new openness, a vulnerability that made his breath catch. For the first time since he'd found her in that alley, she didn't immediately look away when their eyes met. In that moment, Jack realized that while he'd been so focused on saving Emily's life, something else had begun to heal as well. The broken pieces of his own heart that he'd thought were beyond repair. The morning light filtered through the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Jack had just finished clearing their breakfast dishes, the clinking of plates filling the quiet space. Emily sat at the small dining table, her face pale but determined as she pushed away her half-eaten toast. Bear lay nearby, his watchful eyes never leaving Emily's side. "At least you ate something," Jack said, trying to sound encouraging. "That's better than—" His words cut off as Emily suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Her eyes went wide with panic, and she slumped forward onto the couch beside her. Bear jumped up, whining anxiously. "Emily!" Jack rushed to her side, his heart pounding. The scene was too familiar. Sarah had looked just like this before. No, he couldn't think about that now. His hands shook as he reached for his phone. "Hold on, Emily. Just hold on." Emily's breathing came in short, painful gasps. Her fingers clutched at Jack's sleeve, her knuckles white with effort. Bear paced anxiously beside them, letting out soft whimpers. 911. What's your emergency?" Jack's voice cracked as he reported their location and Emily's condition. The minutes until the ambulance arrived felt like hours. He held Emily's hand, murmuring words of encouragement, trying to keep her conscious. Bear pressed against Emily's legs, offering what comfort he could. The paramedics burst through the door in a flurry of activity and urgent voices. Jack stepped back, watching helplessly as they worked on Emily, his chest tight with fear. The same fear he'd felt when Sarah... At the hospital, the fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Emily's face as she lay in the hospital bed. The steady beep of monitors filled the sterile air. Jack sat beside her, his body tense with worry as the doctor delivered the news. "Her condition has deteriorated significantly," the doctor explained, his voice grave. "The disease is progressing faster than we anticipated, and her body isn't responding to the current treatment protocol." Jack's throat felt tight. "There has to be something else we can do." Emily's voice came out as barely a whisper. "I told you. I told you I wouldn't make it." Her words were interrupted by labored breathing. Jack grabbed her hand, holding it tightly between both of his. "No, Emily. You are making it. You're fighting." His voice was fierce with determination, even as fear threatened to overwhelm him. Emily's eyes met his, and for the first time since he'd known her, there was no wall between them. No resistance, just gratitude and something else. Trust, perhaps. She squeezed his hand weakly. The doctor cleared his throat. "There is one option," he said hesitantly. "It's an experimental treatment. The results have been unpredictable. Some patients have shown remarkable improvement, while others—" He left the sentence unfinished. "What are the risks?" Jack asked, his grip on Emily's hand tightening. "The treatment is aggressive. In her weakened state, there's no guarantee her body can handle it. But without intervention—" The doctor's expression was grim. "I'll give you some time to think about it." After the doctor left, silence filled the room. Emily's breathing was shallow, each breath a visible struggle. Jack watched her chest rise and fall, remembering how helpless he'd felt watching Sarah slip away. He couldn't go through that again. He wouldn't. "Jack," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible, "I'm scared." The admission struck him like a physical blow. This was Emily, strong, defiant Emily, who had fought so hard to keep everyone at arm's length, who had been ready to give up just days ago. Now she was fighting, and he wasn't about to let her fight alone. "I know," he said softly, "but you're not alone anymore. Whatever happens, I'm right here." The doctor returned an hour later, needing an answer. Jack looked at Emily, saw the fear in her eyes, but also the determination. She nodded slightly. "We'll do it," Jack said firmly. "We'll try the treatment." As the medical team prepared Emily for the procedure, Jack stood by her bed, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision. The next few hours would determine everything. He watched as they wheeled her away, remembering her words from just days ago about dying alone and being forgotten. "Not this time," he whispered to himself. "Not this time." The steady beep of medical equipment filled the hospital room as Emily lay connected to an array of tubes and wires. The experimental treatment machine hummed quietly beside her bed, its display showing a constant stream of numbers and readings that Jack couldn't fully understand. He sat in the chair next to her, his shoulders tense, watching every slight change in her expression. Bear lay at the foot of the bed, his chin resting on the edge of the mattress. His eyes never left Emily's face, and occasionally his tail would thump softly against the floor when she stirred. "Huh?" The German shepherd's presence seemed to bring a sense of calm to the sterile hospital room. Jack leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles were white. The doctors had warned him about the risks, but what choice did they have? Emily's condition had deteriorated so quickly that this experimental treatment was their only option. He watched as the clear liquid dripped steadily through the IV line, praying it would be enough to save her. Emily's eyes fluttered open and closed, her consciousness drifting like leaves in the wind. Jack noticed her fingers twitching slightly on the white hospital sheets, and he reached out to hold her hand. Her skin felt cool to the touch, but there was still strength in her grip when she squeezed back. During one of her more lucid moments, Emily's eyes opened fully, focusing on Jack with surprising clarity. Tears began to well up, rolling slowly down her pale cheeks. Her voice was barely above a whisper, rough with emotion and fatigue. "I never wanted to be alone," she confessed, each word seeming to cost her tremendous effort. "I didn't want to die alone, and I didn't want anyone to see me this way." Jack felt his throat tighten as he gently wiped away her tears with his thumb. "You're not alone," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You never have been." He moved his chair closer, keeping her hand firmly in his. Bear lifted his head, watching the exchange with intelligent eyes, before settling back down with a soft whine. "I was so scared," Emily continued, her words coming out in short bursts between shallow breaths. "When I first got sick, my family couldn't handle it. They just disappeared. And I thought it would be better if I disappeared too." Jack squeezed her hand. "I understand that feeling," he admitted. "After I lost Sarah and Shadow, I wanted to disappear too. I thought if I could just fade away, the pain would stop." Emily turned her head slightly to look at him better. How did you keep going?" Jack was quiet for a moment, considering her question. "I didn't, not really. I was just existing, not living, until you and Bear showed up in that storm." He managed a small smile. "Sometimes life has a way of forcing us to keep going, even when we think we can't." "I'm sorry," Emily whispered, fresh tears falling. "I'm sorry I tried to push you away. I couldn't bear the thought of someone else leaving me." "I'm not leaving," Jack said firmly. "I'm right here, Emily, and I'm not going anywhere." Bear chose that moment to stand up and move closer to Emily's head, gently nuzzling her hand. A weak smile touched her lips as she scratched behind his ears. "I abandoned him," she said softly, looking at Bear. I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't want him to watch me die." "He found his way back to you," Jack reminded her. "He led me to you. Maybe that's what was meant to happen all along." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds being the steady beep of the monitors and Bear's contented sighs as Emily continued to pet him weakly. "I'm tired of being afraid," Emily finally said, her voice stronger despite her exhaustion. "I'm tired of pushing people away because I'm scared they'll leave first." Jack nodded, understanding perfectly. "Then stop pushing. Let us help you fight this." Emily's eyes met his, and for the first time since he'd known her, there was no wall between them, no defensive barrier, no attempt to hide her vulnerability. She was finally letting him see her, truly see her, and the trust in her gaze made his heart ache. Jack leaned forward, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're going to be okay, Emily," he whispered. "You're not giving up now." A faint smile touched her lips, and though her eyes were tired, they held something new: hope. Bear licked her hand as if offering his own reassurance, his tail wagging slowly against the hospital floor. The hours passed slowly after that, marked by the steady rhythm of the machines and the quiet conversation between them. They talked about everything and nothing, their fears, their regrets, the moments that had led them here. Emily's condition remained critical, but there was something different in the air now. A subtle shift, like the first warm breeze after a long winter, promising that change was possible. Emily's eyes opened to the soft morning light filtering through the hospital window. The experimental treatment had left her feeling drained, but something was different. Her chest didn't feel as heavy, and each breath came a little easier than before. Jack sat in his usual spot beside her bed, dark circles under his eyes betraying his sleepless night of vigil. Bear remained faithful at the foot of the bed, his warm presence a constant comfort. "How are you feeling?" Jack asked softly, leaning forward in his chair. His voice was rough from exhaustion, but his eyes were alert and watchful. Emily took a moment to assess herself before answering. "Different," she said slowly. Like I can breathe better." She drew in a deep breath to demonstrate, and for the first time in weeks, it didn't trigger a coughing fit. Jack's face softened with relief. He reached out and adjusted her blanket, a gesture that had become familiar over the past few days. "You look better," he said. "Your color's coming back." Bear's tail thumped against the bed as he lifted his head, sensing the change in atmosphere. He crawled a little closer to Emily, careful not to disturb any of the tubes or wires connected to her. The door opened, and Dr. Martinez stepped in, clipboard in hand. His face broke into a smile as he reviewed Emily's charts. "Well, I have some encouraging news," he announced, moving to stand at the foot of the bed. "Your latest blood work shows significant improvement. The experimental treatment appears to be having the effect we hoped for." Jack straightened in his chair, his heart racing. "What exactly does that mean, Doctor?" "It means," Dr. Martinez explained, "that Emily's body is responding to the treatment. Her white blood cell count is stabilizing, and her oxygen levels have improved." He paused, his expression becoming more serious. "However, I want to be clear. It's still too early to make any definitive predictions. We need to monitor her closely and see how she continues to respond." Emily's hand found Jack's, her fingers trembling slightly as they intertwined with his. "Maybe," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I can fight this after all." The words came out hesitant, as if she was afraid to believe them herself. Jack squeezed her hand gently, his throat tight with emotion. "I'll be right here every step of the way," he promised, his voice steady and sure. Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. "Now let's talk about the next phase of treatment," he said, pulling up a chair. "We want to focus on strengthening your immune system, Emily. This will involve a combination of medications and therapy." He outlined a comprehensive treatment plan, explaining each step carefully. "It won't be easy," he warned. "The road to recovery is long, and there will be difficult days. But with proper support and care, we have reason to be hopeful." Emily listened intently, her grip on Jack's hand tightening slightly. For the first time since her diagnosis, she allowed herself to imagine a future, not just surviving, but living. It was a frightening thought, but also exhilarating. "When can we start?" she asked, determination creeping into her voice. "We'll begin the new medication regimen today," Dr. Martinez replied. "The physical therapy will start once you're a bit stronger, probably in a few days." As the doctor continued explaining the details, Bear shifted position, carefully laying his head on Emily's chest. His warm weight was comforting, and Emily found herself absently stroking his fur with her free hand. Jack watched the interaction, his heart full. The woman before him was so different from the one he'd found in the snow just days ago, that Emily had been ready to give up, to slip away into the darkness. This Emily, though still weak and uncertain, had a spark in her eyes, a will to live that hadn't been there before. After Dr. Martinez left, Emily settled back against her pillows, clearly tired, but more peaceful than she'd been in days. "Jack?" she murmured. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I'd given up on myself." Jack smiled softly, adjusting her blanket again. "One day at a time, Emily. That's all we need to focus on right now." Bear's tail thumped in agreement, his eyes moving between the two humans as if understanding every word. Emily's hand rested on his head, drawing strength from his steady presence. The morning light grew stronger, casting a warm glow across the room. Outside, life went on as usual, doctors making their rounds, nurses checking on patients, visitors coming and going. But in this quiet moment, something had shifted. Hope, fragile but persistent, had taken root. Emily's eyes began to drift closed, the morning's events having drained her limited energy. Jack remained in his chair, watching over her as she slept, his hand still holding hers. Bear maintained his protective position, his gentle breathing synchronized with Emily's. The next few days would bring their own challenges, new treatments to endure, strength to rebuild, fears to face. But for now, in this moment, there was peace. And sometimes Jack knew that was enough to build on. Jack helps Emily transition from the hospital to his cabin, where she slowly regains strength. Their days fall into a peaceful routine, but emotional wounds linger. One evening, Emily opens up about her estranged brother, Daniel, revealing years of pain and regret. Recognizing the unspoken longing for reconciliation, Jack reaches out to Daniel, urging him to see his sister. Just as hope begins to bloom, Emily suffers a medical setback, her body struggling against treatment. Jack rushes her to the hospital, terrified of losing her. As she fights through fever and exhaustion, he remains by her side, unwavering in his support. Meanwhile, Daniel, shaken by Jack's call, agrees to visit. Their reunion is fraught with emotion. Years of abandonment and hurt surface, but love persists. Slowly, they mend what was broken, sharing laughter, regrets, and old memories. As Daniel integrates into their new life, Emily finds renewed purpose. No longer just surviving, she begins living again. With Jack and Daniel's encouragement, she revives a long-forgotten dream, opening a pet store. Emily's paw prints becomes a hub of warmth and second chances, a place where animals and people find new beginnings. Bear, ever the steadfast guardian, becomes the store's beloved mascot. Seasons change, and so do they. Emily's health stabilizes, Daniel finds redemption, and Jack lets go of past grief. Their once broken lives weave together into something whole, a family reborn. As they sit on the cabin porch, the autumn sun painting the sky, they know they have found home, not just in a place, but in each other. If you enjoyed the story of Jack, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. If you enjoyed the story of Jack, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.